to Dr. Fawcett.
Thank you, Scott. It's good to be here. I missed last week, and I missed this one. This is not part of my Wednesday evening, so it's great to be here tonight. I wanted to, I've known a couple people in my world that have had some trouble lately in their recovery, and wanted to go back to something we've talked about before, but with a slightly different angle maybe tonight. And that's just the whole idea of managing triggers and cravings. And I think when we have these intensity addictions like sex addiction or porn addiction or chemsex, those, what would kind of be a normal human-sized trigger, those particular addictions, because of the dopamine involved and the imprint they do on the brain, really those triggers can become an obsession in a way that I think is more powerful than some other addictions. And so I want to go over sort of just some general strategies to deal with triggers, but I also want to just highlight the potential impact, because what happened in the case of a good friend of mine is that he basically for the last week has been fighting off one trigger after another, but what happened was the obsession caught fire. And he, despite his best intention and actions and a week's worth of resistance, finally briefly succumbed. He's back and it's all okay, but it was that power of that, the image that, and this is a testimony to the power of these dopamine-related addictions that we have, where they burn so bright and the instinct is so strong, it overrides our rational mind's ability to kind of tamp them down and put out the fire. So it was a huge reminder of how easy it is to become obsessed. So first of all, triggers. You know, everybody's different, and so we really have to identify, and it's one of the primary tasks of recovery, is to identify our personal set of triggers, because they can be internal as external, as we've talked about. The internal ones are feelings, and those, what triggers me may be somebody else in terms of my own feelings, but it can also be stuff out there, whether it's a street or a bar or a website or a person or a brand of car or whatever it is. That we have to learn what those are and really start to respect them and create a strategy to deal with them. So everybody's different, but we are going to have them. And I think it's really important to look and see what that might be. One thing that sometimes people overlook is time. You know, I think the transition times in our days, the end of a work day, before evening, or the beginning of something, or even a lunch hour, those kind of transition times can be very difficult. After a difficult phone call, after a fight with somebody we care about, all those things are highly triggers. So they're a very real part of recovery that really it's our obligation to know. And then we have to have a plan. If we can't avoid them, which is probably the best strategy, to not go there if you can't. But some things like feelings, if they come up, or emotional triggers or situations, we have to learn how to diffuse them and create a plan for dealing with those. And that's incredibly important. And one of the things, and this is what I was kind of reminded this week, is that when these occur, it's despite your best efforts, they're going to keep coming back. They're quite relentless. And I think they're so strong, the urge, that we really have to just do it's all out war to kind of deal with it. But it's interesting in that if we have an obsessive kind of thought, one thing that's not going to work very well is to try to tell ourselves not to think about it or not to go there. So we can't really use that negative, because that just kind of reinforces the central focus of that thought or statement is still the very trigger that we're trying not to think about. And so we have to really kind of distract ourselves and do more positive actions. And I think always action first. Call somebody, take a walk, go to a meeting, have coffee with somebody, just get out and make contact before you try to figure it out. I think at least my instinct is to try to figure out, why is this happening? What's going on? And you know, we can figure it out later, but you have to really take action at first to kind of try to put out that deadly obsession. And then we need to really predict high risk incidents, what's going to be most threatening to me, and create a plan in advance. You know, at Seeking Integrity, we have these emergency exit plans, where just like we used to do in school, where we do fire drill practices. And the same thing goes on in relapse. Once we are triggered, it's like we regress. All our adult tools kind of fade away. That triggering thing becomes like central, larger than life appeal and draw. And we kind of lose our smarts, if you will. We have to try to sit and create a strategy at that moment. It's too late. We need to have it pre-planned when we're in our right mind, and we can plan it and then just practice and practice and practice. And it has to be like muscle memory. So when those things do occur, we can handle it. And then underlying all of that, of course, is taking care of ourselves routinely, right? If we are hungry or angry or lonely or tired, that famous HALT expression that we hear so much in 12-step program, we are going to be at higher risk just because we're out of balance. We're not, we don't have all our resources. We're not well rested. We're not feeling emotionally stable. We're cranky because we haven't had a meal. Whatever it is, that can really throw us off. And just those little elements of self-care can make a huge difference between kind of disaster or managing something really important. So I think, taking action then when they occur, but I think it's important also to not react. Just reacting would be like doing something kind of on the spur of the moment. Taking an action are these pre-planned strategies that we think about in advance, we create, we practice, we go through them, and that really is kind of our best protection. And then one final thing that I've seen over the years, not recently, but I've had clients do this where we don't want to test ourselves with the triggers, right? I had a meth guy in recovery who kept a little bit of meth in the freezer just to prove that he didn't have to use it. Well, that's what he said. That's kind of a stupid strategy, right? And guess what? That didn't turn out so well. We don't test ourselves with addiction. These addictions, these triggers, they're bigger than us. And it's just a bad strategy to try to do it. That's why in the S programs, to really carefully evaluate your circle plan and see if there's something that maybe is in the middle circle that might be a little more dangerous than it might appear, or vice versa. Just we really have to evaluate these things very carefully, because in my experience too, we, like when we're in that addiction bubble, we're not thinking clearly. And so I think it's always good to run these decisions and our strategies and our plans by somebody else just to get some input on it, because sometimes we are blind or have blind spots in terms of the strategies that we need to do. So bottom line, I've said this before, it's this really stressful time. People are on the edge, and these triggers are out there. And boy, with sex addiction and porn addiction and chemsex, when they appear, they can be relentless and just get anchored in our brains so that it becomes almost impossible to think about anything else. That's that obsession. And I don't know anything short of a lot of meetings, a lot of talking, a lot of recovery connection that can really stop that, and persistence. Sometimes it can take a while to get through that. It'll pass, but boy, we have to be careful and vigilant. I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, David. And I just kind of wanted to add that sometimes it's not the big triggers that send us over the edge, it's the little triggers. I can handle the pandemic, I can handle the fires, but somebody cuts me off in traffic and then I want to go drink.
That's so true. So true.
The big stuff I can let go of, and then unexpected stuff that crops up. If I'm not expecting to, if I'm just going to, the drive up at McDonald's and not expecting to see anybody that catches my eye, and somebody does, that can be a really strong trigger, for just because I'm not ready, my guard's not up. If I know I'm going to an event and everybody's going to be in fancy dress and, most of them are going to have a cocktail in them and they're going to be a little loosey-goosey, I'm ready for that. It's just like the little random stuff that really, really get me.
Out of the blue. And those little random events still have great power, even with some time in recovery. They can come out of the blue and just really throw us off our game. We have to kind of always be prepared for those, for sure.
Yeah. So everybody ask us questions about anything to do with addiction and recovery. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We love your questions. And we have one in here already, so we're going to take it. Okay. I had fallen into some patterns of compulsive sexual behavior prior to meeting my current partner of 2 years. As our relationship evolved, I emerged from those behaviors and we've been fully monogamous for 1.5 years. But I feel at times that my history has left a psychological mark in terms of how I enter into a relationship. For example, guilt and feeling attracted to other guys, and relationship doubts emerging from an unbalanced mental weight on sex relative to all the other beautiful aspects of our relationship. Can you speak at all to the psychology of a relationship after recovery, and any practices or conversations this might foster, or that might foster continued healing, understanding, and growth? Interesting question.
Yeah, great question, actually. And something that I think people often struggle with. I think, Seeking Integrity, we described a lot of the sex addiction as an intimacy disorder or attachment disorder, where a lot of addicts in general, I think, but especially sex addicts, often have trouble with that emotional connecting part. A lot of people have had a lot of sex, but it was a very different kind of interaction. And so when we come together and form a relationship or in a couple, it's sometimes dealing with those issues from a very new place, and it feels awkward and it feels raw, and we're feeling feelings, I think. And this is probably true for most people in American culture, at least. We learn how to have sex and be in relationships with the benefit of mood altering substances. And so I think if we're trying to approach intimacy without anything that's going to distract us or change our mood or numb us or put a barrier between us and our feelings, it's a very real experience, and it can be a very intense experience. So I think that, and there's those echoes you spoke of the kind of old patterns, maybe hookup patterns or just sexual patterns that kind of echo, and those never went further in terms of developing intimacy and vulnerability and trust. And so I think these are all issues that we need to work on. In general, the clients I've seen that have had the most success I would say, have started to do a lot of work on themselves. And it maybe sounds counterintuitive. You're working on a relationship, but you really have to bring, two complete adults to a relationship. I haven't complained about this piece of jewelry in a long time, but on QVC or one of those shows, they had a piece of jewelry as a necklace, but it was two hearts, two halves of a heart, one half here and one half here, and you put them together, and together, we are, the two of us can make one person, which is like a big X in terms of healthy relationships, right? We need to be two complete people coming together, and those two complete people have to really have done some work on themselves in terms of vulnerability and trust and sustaining relationships and working through problems. And because it's so easy to, hit a bump, as every couple does, that's just normal. And then, and instead of working it through in a healthy way, people react or worse, separate. And so, and then they just repeat the pattern. So I think good for you for being conscious of this, for thinking about these things and working it through and making an effort. It's not easy, but boy, the rewards are great. If you choose to be in a relationship and can make it work, it's tremendous. And so good for you. I think the two words I've mentioned already are important to think about: vulnerability, how you can be vulnerable, and meaning be open, share your feelings, be willing to take risks in a safe way, and trust, trusting that you can be you for better or for worse, and that your partner is going to work with you on that. And so I think it just takes good communication, it takes empathy, it takes understanding, it takes patience, and it takes kind of self-compassion. I think we really have to go easy on ourselves. It's like we are trying to do an advanced course in relationship building, having no skills at all. And so we have to we hit the ground running sometimes. But yeah, I think good communication. If you hit bumps in the road or feel you could use help, there are different kinds of couples therapists. There's CSATs that do some of this work to understand sex addiction. There's Imago couples therapy, which I really like, emphasizes a lot of the dialogue and communication between the two people. So there's help out there. And then one thing I talk about a lot here, just you can Google it, is the sensate focus exercise, which is really great for couples to it's a Masters and Johnson couples exercise that ends up as kind of a sexual communication piece, but it starts out non-sexual. It starts out sensual feeling, just a way of building intimacy and just sharing with each other. And I guess it's building depth to the relationship. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot, there's some stuff packed into the backstory that I just kind of want to unpack a little bit, and it may or may not apply to the person asking this question, but I think it's worth bringing up. A lot of times sex addicts will get into a relationship thinking the relationship will fix their addiction. And for a year or a year and a half or 2 years, it kind of does, but they don't do the work. And then the pandemic comes along and they're sneaking looks at porn, and 3 months later they're at a strip club, and 3 months after that they're sleeping around. Do you see that pattern? Because I see it certainly in 12-step groups. Do you see that pattern where somebody thinks, I finally got the relationship, everything's okay now, and they drop all the work, and then everything is okay for a while until it's not okay?
Right. I think that's probably, unfortunately, too common in that we can get into a relationship and there's a lot of dopamine, there's a lot of oxytocin, there's a lot of hormones flying around, and that thing called limerence, when we first fall in love with somebody, it's basically a mood alteration. We're kind of high on the hormones, and it feels great and it keeps us connected. But that stabilizes after a while, and we start to get complacent, I think, in the relationship. And then that's where, if we don't continue to do the work, especially on our recovery, those other kind of elements creep in. And it's really sustaining the relationship once it goes into a more mature phase is where maybe the harder work is. So yeah, absolutely. We have to really keep working. In fact, more than ever, I think it's important when we get into a relationship, because it's going to be more complicated, right? If there's another person in our life, just things are more complicated. There's other people's feelings to think of, and other schedules, and other concerns. And so we have to work that much harder to make it a success. So, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the bliss of the relationship can only carry you so far, and then the underlying problems, if they're not dealt with, are still going to crop up. And this is true with not just sex addiction, but with alcoholism, drug addiction, gambling, any addiction.
Right.
If we don't deal with the underlying issues, it will come back. It's doing push-ups in the corner, waiting for us.
Right. We can never get complacent about this. Lifelong. I mean, that's just the nature of it. We have to keep moving forward. If we stop, we're in trouble.
We've got some more questions, but I've got a couple more that I want to pull out of here. This individual, I'm assuming this is a gay relationship, but it could be a female asking the question. But now that the relationship is underway, there is guilt in feeling attracted to other guys. David, thoughts?
Yeah, so just because we get into a relationship doesn't mean that we stop noticing people or even stop having those attractions. I think that's sort of natural. It's really my feeling is what we do with those attractions, right? We don't feed them, we don't nurture them, we kind of diffuse them, but I think those impulses, those attractions are to some extent hardwired in us. We're going to notice people. But I think if we start paying too much attention to that and really feeding on that and starting to get little dopamine hits from those things, then that can be really destructive. And I will say, just energetically, partners feel that stuff, right? It's the equivalent of, having coffee with somebody and you're talking to them and their eyes are looking over here and over there, and just, it's very disconcerting and distracting and not a nice way to treat somebody. But and it may not be that obvious, but people feel that too. So I think it's really important to pay attention to that, to work on that, to see what's going on. We're going to naturally notice people, but I think if we start to really look for people and feed it and pay too much attention to that, that's a problem.
Yeah, I'm going to notice people no matter what, but if my antenna is up and I'm noticing people, that's a different story. In my work groups, we always talk about, is your antenna up when you're doing that? Are you shopping? Are you hunting? Are you whatever you call it? If David and I were having coffee and I noticed somebody and Dave was like, "Hey, you're paying attention to me," I would snap back and say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, but there's some serious hotness over there." And he would look and we would have a little laugh and then we would get on with our conversation. I wouldn't obsess about that person once I was called out on it, and David wouldn't obsess about me, noticing that person. And, sometimes just acknowledging it, I guess, is an okay thing, depending on the relationship.
I think that's true. Absolutely, it's true. And I will say, in the gay community, as I'm a gay man, I think there's kind of more tolerance or encouragement of that kind of stuff too. It's kind of a joking kind of thing, but I think it really has to depend on the relationship. Some partners are not cool with that, and we really have to sort of be respectful of whoever we're with, and follow that guide in terms of how we behave.
Yeah, and female partners who've been betrayed may not be as understanding, I think. I mean, if Giselle Bundchen or whatever her name is, the one that's married to Tom Brady, walks in the room, your wife's probably not going to freak out if you happen to notice that it's Giselle, but, because your wife is noticing too. But yeah, just that's a tough one. Okay, the other thing that I just wanted to pull out of this, and then we'll move on to the other questions that we've got. The writer of this question says there's an unbalanced mental weight on sex relative to all the other beautiful aspects of a relationship. And I just wanted to comment, and maybe David will have some thoughts on this as well. Addictive sex, which is what you had before, is very non-intimate. It's all about the sex. We put a lot of fantasy into it. It rarely lives up to the fantasy, but there's a lot of fantasy. And that's what drives the addiction. We live in this fantasy bubble, and that's how we escape from the world. That's how we get drunk, basically, is we just juice ourselves up with fantasy. And then when you step away from that type of sex and try to do this intimately, emotionally connected sex, it's not a fantasy, it's a reality. But you still want the intensity of that fantasy. And I think it's natural to put this unbalanced weight on that sex, regardless of all the other beautiful aspects of the relationship. And I love how you word that, by the way. David, do you see that? Do you kind of?
Yeah, I do. I think that's where that sensate focus exercise I mentioned would be really useful. But I really like the distinction you laid out, Scott, which is that with addiction, I guess it goes back to the intention, right? The intention of sexual acting out is to really disconnect, to get into our heads, and even if we're having sex with somebody in our addiction, they're like a prop in whatever fantasy is playing out in our head. We're not really, it's not a give and take like a real emotional, sensual connection would be. So the intention with what I hate healthy, but healthy sex, the opposite of addictive sex, whatever we call that. But the intention there is really not disconnection at all. Just like you said, it's really more actually to dive deeper into connection, to be really there, feeling wise, physically, energetically, and it can be awkward, it can be funny, it's all different things, but it's real, and it's authentic, and it feels good. And so I think just check the intention. Sometimes people make the mistake of trying to replicate some of that intensity in these kind of relationships. Not that, intensity is fine, and you want intensity to some extent, but it's not always going to be intense. It's not always going to be that numbing, fantasy intense. We have to kind of grieve that kind of addictive acting out, I think. And I see that on steroids with a lot of chemsex, meth users who do all this kind of crazy acting out, and it's very, very intense, but it's not even enjoyable after a while. It's just kind of crazy. But it's almost the polar opposite of an emotional connection in a relationship where you have a three-dimensional person, not a fantasy, not a living sex prop. But
yeah, I've had guys say literally, I cheated on my wife using my wife. They objectified their wife to the point where it wasn't their wife anymore, and then used her sexually. And they felt like, and the wife felt cheated on as well, because she, as a person, was discounted from the equation. And that's what you want to avoid as you bring in all the other beautiful aspects. And that's what the sensate focus thing will do. And it's two people there, not one person and a body.
Right.
Yeah. So, Next question here. My wife is constantly attaching barbs into her communication, in addition to telling me how she is going to get even and what she is specifically going to do to other men. It hurts. Any advice?
Well,
I don't know if this is a situation where our questioner has cheated and the wife is getting even, or the questioner is the betrayed part. I'm not sure. But
yeah,
anyway.
so I think any kind of barbs in communication, that kind of hostility is really, not productive for anybody. I think it's kind of passive aggressive. First of all, it's an indirect kind of way to be angry, and I just think it's not helpful. So I guess I don't know if you guys have sought any kind of couples counseling, but I think those kind of communication skills or exercises, and sometimes, frankly, just being in a therapist's office with a third party who can guide you and stop and interrupt when it kind of goes off the rails, and point out, wait, let's hit the pause button. What just happened here, and just kind of point it out. And sometimes those patterns can be seen. On occasion, the person's not aware of it. Sometimes they are, but I think if there's that much anger that's kind of leaking out into the conversation, it's not going to be helpful for anybody. That's not and by the way, if you're that angry and making those comments, you're generally not a happy person either. And so I think, plus the idea of, it sounds kind of threatening. So I don't know, of course it hurts. One way to respond, I don't know how you respond, but I love the sentence I teach my clients, the STEM sentence, when you do X, it makes me feel Y. So, when you put barbs into your conversation when we're trying to talk, it makes me feel hurt. And that's a nice, clean way of giving response to somebody. You're simply saying, this behavior causes this feeling in me. And that kind of thing is useful to process. I don't know all the backstory here either, but
our questioner says they were separated and he slept with other women, including prostitutes. So there's our backstory.
And partners are traumatized and angry and hurt and devastated often. And so, and I understand those feelings. I think though, what you don't want to do, what I hate to see someone do, is get locked into that anger, because it's a miserable existence. And so I would encourage her to find help and get some support in dealing with those feelings and moving out of them in any way she can, because that can't be fun. But I understand that place, but it's not a place you want to get stuck. And so I think some support, therapists, CSAT, or someone might be able to help her, give her some tools that she could use to kind of move out of that and move past it.
Yeah, and as a couple, you can develop kind of a toxic relationship dance where you each know all the steps and you just keep doing the dance over and over, even though you're stomping on each other's toes, and it hurts. And until nothing changes if nothing changes. So there is definitely, you getting help, her getting help, and the couple getting help, where you can set some communication boundaries and talk about how to communicate your feelings productively, both of you. Highly recommend.
But I think ideally the kind of healing strategy for a couple would be both individuals getting their support and recovery, at least for several months, usually with therapy, and then doing the couple's work a little bit later. But I think until you both kind of get grounded in your feelings and kind of understanding where you're at, because it's a whirlwind. And when you're in that crazy dance that Scott was just describing, it's really hard to identify feelings and not be in reactive mode all the time. And just so it takes some time to kind of let the dust settle, start to get some tools, and then I think it's productive for the couple to start doing their work.
Yeah, and in the heat of the moment, both halves of a relationship may be wondering, do we want to stay together or not? And if you ultimately decide no, then all that couples work is probably not so useful, But the individual work still will be very, very helpful to either or both of you. Yeah.
And by the way, I've seen couples. I read a statistic once that a big portion of people that seek out couples counseling are actually looking for a way to kind of do a healthy separation, a detachment, a divorce, a split, which I think is actually great because it, rather than walk away scarred or angry or wounded, is to have a breakup in a healthy way is a far
Particularly
better
if there are
way to do
kids
it.
involved.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. Because kids absorb all that energy.
Hi, doctors. Recently discovered sex addiction, affairs, and hookups. This person is 2 months in recovery. It's going well. My wife and I are living apart while we work on the marriage. She wants to track me digitally. I work in a security sensitive job, but I have done what I can by giving her the master password to my Google account. With this, she can see a lot, but admittedly, I could circumvent the tracking to some extent if I wanted. She wants a more robust tracker, but my phone is company issued and monitored for certain types of security issues and could cause me to get in trouble and be outed at work as a sex addict. I cannot find a commercial tracker that doesn't violate what they monitor for. My wife seems to spend a lot of her waking hours tracking data, peppering me with questions even in the middle of the night. She gets upset until she understands the data. It feels unhealthy. Any advice appreciated? Is it normal for spouses to track? She feels yes, and it's a deal breaker for her. I'm between a rock and a hard place. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll answer this. I'd value your opinion on this too, Scott. I think this is not an unusual thing. I have a client right now who has a similar situation. In general, again, I understand the desire for reassurance or assurance by tracking data, by getting information, by having polygraphs. But it's really I think at some point there is never enough information to really satisfy that anxiety. So I think sometimes I see spouses kind of wanting more and more and not feeling any better. Now, I do agree that accountability is hugely important. And so that's important. And I think we have to accommodate your wife's need for reassurance with the practical aspects of your job and your work requirements and that sort of thing. In the one case I'm thinking of now, the person, it's an early recovery, decided to do more because he couldn't do that on his phone and computer because of work. He's doing several polygraphs, and that was kind of a compromise that between he and his wife. But I think we have to kind of, in good faith, try to do the best we can to make a compromise here. There are certain jobs that is going to be a problem with. I think there's a point at which more information is not even going to be helpful, but we have to honor the intent of that and for accountability. I don't know, Scott, you've probably encountered this more. Any thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Michelle Mays, who's a therapist on the East Coast, she has a blog called partnerhope.com, all one word, partnerhope.com. It's for betrayed partners. It's excellent. And she talks about what she calls Sherlocking, which is this, going through the pockets, going through the wallet, checking the credit card receipt, wanting trackers, wanting this, wanting that, constant questioning. And she talks to the betrayed partners and says, you got to stop. It's going to make you crazy. Here's how you go about this. And what she recommends and what we recommend at our treatment center and when we're working with people individually is a therapeutic disclosure. It's a process where, and it takes several months to get through this process where you get everything down on paper that you've done. She'll submit some questions to her therapist, to your therapist, to you, and you answer all the questions plus anything else you think she's going to want to know about what happened and what's continuing to happen or not continuing to happen. Then you share that. Then you take a polygraph so she knows she's got it all, and then you agree to follow up. Then there's a lot more follow up. It's a long and involved therapy-centric, therapy monitored, driven. Not getting the right word, but it's a therapeutic process. Usually there are 3 therapists involved: yours, hers, and the couples. Sometimes it's just 2 therapists. And you agree to follow up polygraphs, and give her full access to bank accounts. Give her, let her open your phone and read your text messages. Let her, check your Facebook page. Let her, give her all those passwords. Make sure she has access to bank accounts, all of it. Credit card receipts, just, but really probably what needs to happen is a proper therapeutic disclosure. David, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean,
yeah, I think the disclosure is always appropriate and almost essential. And Scott's exactly right. It takes time. It's even after somebody coming out of residential treatment, it's probably going to take a month or two before they're ready to do disclosure. It's a formal process that takes time to do. And the disclosure is not something, one of the most painful and ineffective things you can do is what we call a rolling disclosure, right? Dribs and drabs, a little bit here, a little bit there. Just when they think they have all the information and they're starting to feel the ground underneath their feet again, something else comes out. That's exactly the wrong, most harmful way to do it. That's why it's a very complete, thorough, very formal document that's actually shared between therapists. It's like a written disclosure and an agreement almost of what happened. So, and
then she gets to respond about how she was impacted, and then you get to respond saying, I feel your pain. Here are the things I'm going to do to make sure this isn't going to happen again. And like I said, there's a lot of follow-up. There's a lot of accountability with it. And what she wants, and probably what you want too, is to get all the truth out there so that your relationship can find ground zero and move forward from there instead of, she thinks she's at ground zero, but she's catastrophizing that she's at ground 50 and ground zero is way down there and she's not sure. And that prevents the relationship from healing until she or he knows the truth. The relationship is going to struggle to move forward. That's why the therapeutic disclosure, and plus it gets it all out at once. You avoid that sort of death by paper cut. Here's a little bit. I'll agree to what you already know, but I'm not going to tell you anything else, kind of deal.
The other thing about how the disclosure is written is that it's written in a way that is not hurtful for the partner. It's by the nature of some of the material, of course, it's going to be hurtful, but not every painful detail has to be listed, right? It's sometimes maybe categories of things or events, but not, this time it's just not going into
the language is not graphic and things like that. That's one of the reasons we need therapists to guide it. So, they can say too much, reel it in, or not enough. So is the process of healing sexual trauma different for incidents that happen in early childhood versus adulthood? My CSET helped me to write a full sexual history and become aware of a boundary that was crossed with my kindergarten teacher. After that incident, I started having sexual dreams with older women and became obsessed with getting attention and physical touch from many of my female teachers. I feel somewhat hopeless about healing a trauma that happened at an early age in a way that I do not feel about sexual trauma that happened in my early 20s. I fear that my emotional maturity is stunted because of this early trauma.
Great question. Well, the good news, I think, is that there are trauma therapies that are very effective for trauma at an early age, especially this kind of trauma. Trauma is treatable. And I think it's important to understand that. The difference between early childhood trauma and adult trauma, these days, at least, if a trauma occurs, we can intervene much more quickly to mitigate the damage that might occur and hopefully prevent the formation of PTSD and that kind of thing. But the behavior you described is pretty typical of somebody who's been traumatized, where that becomes part of their arousal template, that the idea, the dynamics, the interest, although it's abuse and considered trauma, that may be confusing for you because it might not have been perceived as a traumatic event or abuse at all. Maybe you like the attention and that kind of thing. So I think it's very common then for that to get incorporated into who we are. That's why there's a lot of recognition that early sexual abuse can really kind of impact our arousal templates, and it does impact those in a way. The good news, though, as I say, is that the trauma work is very effective at dealing some of that, and things like EMDR, and there's many other trauma therapies that are out there. We've gotten really good at this in the last 10 years, a lot of different therapies. I think one thing important to consider is that trauma work, especially early child trauma work, is not just a cognitive process. Trauma is registered in our bodies. It's a body-mind kind of thing. And a lot of the trauma therapies take that into account, and help resolve that as well. So I would seek out a certified trauma therapist. It sounds like your CSAT has a lot of awareness, and I'm sure they can help you identify someone if many CSATs do trauma work themselves. So I think it's imminently treatable. And I think it's important to do, because that's what we find, as you kind of laid out beautifully here, is that those events impact our attractions and our relationships for our life if we don't kind of do something to heal them. And that's important, because you're going to probably replicate potentially self-destructive patterns if you don't address that and work with it.
Yeah, I mean, the last sentence here, I fear that my emotional maturity is stunted because of this early trauma. And I thought, yeah, probably not across the board emotional maturity, but parts of it are impacted by things that happen that sometimes we don't even remember because we're so young when they happen.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely.
But it sounds like you're in good hands and got good awareness there. So
yeah,
I feel very positive.
I had full disclosure with my wife a couple of weeks ago. Do you have any help with how to regain trust and thoughts on the recovery process?
Okay.
Regain trust, tell the truth and tell it faster.
Right. That's good. Yeah, it's probably not a magic secret formula, is it? So first of all, congratulations to full disclosure. That's important. That's a big event. It's a draining event, emotionally challenging event. So, but it's a really, as we pointed out earlier, it's a really healing, a benchmark for that healing process to really move forward. So I think it's great. In terms of regaining trust and thoughts in the recovery process, it's time, authenticity, good faith, integrity, all those things that we know, but I think we have to put them in action. I think one of the frustrations sometimes is that the recovery timetable for the partner and the addict are very different. I think the addict wants to have that trust regained much sooner than the partner is willing to give it. And so there's a mismatch sometimes that you just have to work with and be patient. But I think like Scott said, just being frank, being honest, living, if you're going to say you're going to do something, do it, following through with integrity, accountability, all that stuff, that just a good communication, I think empathy. These are some blind spots I think sex addicts have sometimes, that the empathy piece and understanding the impact they've had, and being emotionally present and available. One thing that does take time, I think, to heal for an addict is that tendency we were speaking of at the beginning of this webinar about how we like to kind of go into the bubble and be detached. And I think we really have to fight that urge sometimes and stay present. So I really encourage you to be emotionally present with your wife and with yourself. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's probably, Dr. Rob says, you're looking at 6 to 18 months, probably around the year mark, you're going to start realizing she trusts you again. And that's if you do everything right, if you're rigorously honest, and if you make a mistake, you say, honey, I made a mistake, here's what happened. Being rigorously honest doesn't mean you're mistake-free. It just means that you admit it when you screw up.
And fast.
Yeah, and fast. What was the couples activity Sensate Focus? I'll just take that one for you, David. Masters and Johnson Sensate Focus. My husband of 30 years is
I'll type it in the chat.
Okay. Actually, David, I'll do it because the question that follows is for you.
Okay.
My husband of 30 years is in the early stages of recovery. How long should we have for a period of no sexual activity as part of our healing strategy?
I think that maybe varies by couple. I think maybe a standard kind of benchmark is 90 days. It really depends on the couple and the individuals. I think sometimes people aren't comfortable with that. Sometimes there's certain benchmarks that need to be achieved before they're willing to re-engage, like a disclosure, something like that. So it depends really. But I think there's no hard and fast rule. There's no research. I say 90 days, but some people are going to be comfortable doing it shorter. Some people are going to want to do it longer. I think it really goes back to what we were speaking of earlier with the intention, the connection, and really that sexual activity really has to flow out of the emotional connection. And so I think I think in my experience, sometimes couples just kind of know when it's time, they feel it and they feel comfortable doing it. But I think good communication is how you're going to know. It's one of those things I think you'll know, but you're going to have to stay in good touch with each other and communicate effectively.
And, betrayed partners, if you're not trusting him yet, don't have sex with him. Why do you want to have some sex with somebody you don't fully trust yet? So that may be a while, but maybe not. Maybe, and sex is not relationship glue. That's what I always tell people. It's not relationship glue. It doesn't fix anything. Feels good in the moment, but it's not going to fix your relationship. General thoughts on open relationships. Can they be healthy if both partners are on the same page and have open communication? Can it be healthy after recovery of one or both partners, or is it too risky in terms of personal relapse or personal issues?
Wow.
We get this question once in a while.
Yeah, all of the things being equal, I've known couples that were able to manage that. I think it does take a toll. In couples therapy, they talk about energy leaks in a relationship. They talk about it as a house. And the ideal thing is for a couple is to keep all that energy contained in the house. And then they talk about back doors, right? Those are kind of leaks out of the energy. And if in an open relationship, if somebody's going out and kind of hooking up, even if it's declared and approved and all that, there's a little bit of emotional energy that's escaping the relationship. And I think it does take a toll on the connection. I've known couples that decided to do that. They were fine emotionally with it, but I think their own sex life frankly suffered. So I think it has consequences. That's all other things being equal. Now, when we start to have a history of addiction, I think it gets really tricky because that idea of addiction is just kind of being this fantasy thing where you can float away and be disconnected in our little fantasy activity. In a way, a hookup is sort of like that. It's kind of pulling into that intention of escape and fun and fantasy and this, I'm sex positive. There's nothing wrong with that per se. But I think if somebody has a history of addiction, it can be awfully blurry to start to figure out, okay, when is this not so healthy for me anymore? When is this getting to be a problem? And so I don't know. I'm really cautious about it with my clients who have a history of sexual acting out or sexual compulsivity, just because I think it's playing with fire. I opened this when I were talking about triggers and our own set of triggers, and I think that can be a real trigger for people. And it's like the equivalent of taking a tiger for a walk every day and hoping it's not going to turn around and attack you. It's maybe you can get away with it for a while, but I do think it takes a toll on the relationship. That's just my opinion. I know I live, in a gay community, and I would say I'm probably the norm. And I'm not sure that it doesn't impact some of the relationships and with that kind of just casual approach. So, yeah. Scott, any thoughts?
I always kind of think about it like an alcoholic hanging out in the bar. It's probably not a good idea for an addict. But again, everybody has different goals, different life situations, and every relationship is different. So I'm not going to say no, never, but I'm going to say proceed with extreme caution if you feel that you must proceed. And why don't you try getting your one-on-one relationship right first? Because again, this will not fix your relationship. It might not make it any worse, but it sure as hell isn't going to fix it. If you're trying to fix your relationship problems by opening up the relationship, it ain't going to work.
And I do think it's worth, what are you looking for? You know, is it just excitement, a little dopamine kick, or escape, or, you know, what's the intention there? I think that's worth looking into and asking.
Yeah. We've got a question in the chat feature here. This week, I discovered my husband's of 2 months, I've been in a relationship for 6 years, is a sex addict. We've separated so I can have space and he can begin working on recovery. He's reached out to several therapists, some CSATs, good, and attended several groups on his own just this week. My own CSAT therapist, you have a CSAT too, met with me today and really encouraged an inpatient program for him to kickstart his recovery. Can you share any details on the difference between those two options? I assume one of them is outpatient therapy versus residential to kickstart. Does he have significantly better odds for recovery if he goes to residential recovery, et cetera, et cetera? Thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, look at the circumstances here. I think in general, and probably here as well, I think residential treatment is a real benefit for people for a couple of reasons. One, it just speeds up the whole process. It can, you know, do a year's worth of outpatient therapy in 2 or 3 weeks. But it does more than that. It provides, and like Seek Integrity, we have an intensive model, meaning it's intensive, 7 days a week, very full of activity, full of work, and really tailored work to the individual. So we do a very deep assessment, and we really tailor what they do, what they need, what they get in a way that's very effective. And what the part of the magic sauce is, and of course the staff, but beyond that is the peers, the group. There's an experience about going through treatment with a group of men who have similar experiences, and the bonding and the connection and the healing that takes place. And, you know, ego aside, I think clients get much more out of listening to a peer in a group than they do from me, the facilitator of the group. That's where the power is. And I think giving someone that experience in an intensive guided way can really jumpstart recovery. It's hard to say, does it increase the odds? I think it does, although that kind of literature is very hard to say. But I think I'd encourage you to check out the options. I think just for speed alone, for the intensity of it, I think people basically have a lot of expert guidance in creating this recovery plan and the support network that they can just activate instead of trying to figure it out on their own with a therapist once a week. So I think it just speeds up the whole process and is kind of protective of the process as well.
Yeah, I'll give a plug for our center, Seeking Integrity Los Angeles. You can go to seekingintegrity.com and find out all the info, or you can just use the contact us button on sex and relationship healing. And Tammy Verhoust will call you and answer any questions you have about residential treatment. I'm a big fan of residential. I wouldn't work for a company where we have a residential treatment program if I wasn't a big fan, particularly with sex addiction, where people come into recovery and really have no clue about what this is about. You know, sex addiction recovery is not the same as alcohol or drug recovery. It is the same in certain ways. It's different in other ways. There are such deep relationship issues, and there are usually, you know, really deep underlying issues. And when you get into a treatment center with, you know, 6 to 8 other guys, I think we cap ours at 8, which is very small for a treatment center. And it gets very intense that way. You know, when somebody else is sharing about some childhood trauma issue, you know, we had somebody share about, you know, inappropriateness with a kindergarten teacher. When you know, David shares about that, I'm a lot more likely to talk about my own experiences when I was canoeing at age 10. And we can sort of uncover, and there's something about group therapy that breaks through my denial while it breaks through your denial. And the biggest thing for addicts is we're just so filled with denial. We have so many excuses for our behavior and rationalizations, and you know, we need each other to break through them. And I think a lot of the best work occurs, you know, when I'm at the center, which I haven't been for a while because of the pandemic. I'm usually there in the evening with the guys after they've had a whole day of, nonstop treatment, like 8, 9 hours nonstop, and they're exhausted. And we still talk and still process and still learn new things. And that doesn't happen, when you're in an outpatient setting. You go like for outpatient works. It just takes a lot more time.
Yeah. Check it out. Seek Integrity. We do really great work.
Yeah. So I feel like I just like gave you a big ad, but I'm a big fan of what we do. And we also keep the guys together with our alumni groups, and we stay in contact. And graduates of our program come to these meetings, and there's specifically an alumni meeting every week. And so their support network that they build in that early recovery, which is so powerful, stays with them, which is kind of awesome. So yeah, big fan. But give us a call and talk to Tammy. So anyway, we're out of time, and we made it through all our questions for once. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. Anything you want to say to take us out?
No, just great questions tonight, and just everybody watch these triggers and cravings, and be kind to yourselves and take care of yourselves.
Yeah, we'll be back next week. We'll see you then.
Okay, bye, Scott.